Even amongst the great, while he would allow that with one might be found some, even amongst the great, while he would allow that with one be found some. Even amongst the great, while he would allow that with one might be found some, too, of those gifts which are the marks of Shiva, Narayan had at least 18 of such. He was sensitive to the point of physical pain himself, in his discrimination of hypocrisy, and on one occasion refused to accept a man whose piety of life was regarded by those about him as unimpugnable. The man, he said, with all his decorum, was a whited sepulchre. In spite of constant purification, his presence was contamination. While Narayan, on the other hand, if he were to eat beef in an English hotel, would nevertheless be holy. So holy that his very touch would convey holiness to others. By such sayings, he sought constantly to build up an enduring relation, based firmly on essentials, between those who were to be his supporters and this disciple who was to lead. It was his habit, when a new disciple came to him, to examine him mentally and physically in all possible ways, for the human body was, to his trained eye, as significant in all its parts as any model of a machine to a skilled scientific observer. These examinations, moreover, would include the throwing of the newcomer into a sleep in which he had access to the subconscious mind. The privileged, as I have been told, were permitted in this condition to relate their own story, while from the less honored it was evoked by means of questions. It was after such an examination of Narayan that the master told all about him, that when the day should come for this boy to realize who and what he was, he would refuse for a moment longer to endure the bondage of bodily existence, going out from life. It was after such an examination of Narayan that the master told all about him, that when the day should come for this boy to realize who and what he was, he would refuse for a moment longer to endure the bondage of bodily existence, going out from life with its limitations. And by this was always understood by the disciples the remembering by the lad of what he had already attained, even in this world, in lives anterior to his present consciousness. No menial service to himself was permitted by Sri Ramakrishna from this particular follower. Fanning, the preparation of tobacco, and the 1,001 little attentions commonly rendered to the Guru, all these had to be offered to the master by others. Amongst the many quaint seeming customs of the East, none is more deep-rooted than the prejudice against eating food cooked by one who is not respected. And on this point the Swami's master was as sensitive as a woman. But what he would not eat himself, he would give freely to his favorite disciple. For Narayan, he said, was the roaring fire, burning up all impurity. The core of divinity, again, in this boy's nature was masculine in its quality, as compared to his own merely feminine. Thus, by an attitude of admiration, not unmixed with actual reverence, he created a belief in the destiny of this particular lad, which, when he himself had passed away, was to stand him in good stead, in furnishing authenticity and support to his work. For the Swami was nothing if not a breaker of bondage. And it was essential that there should be those about him who understood the polar difference between his breaches of custom and those of the idly self-indulgent. Nothing in the early days of my life in India struck me so forcibly or so repeatedly as the steadiness with which the other members of the order fulfilled this part of the mission laid upon them. Men whose own lives were cast in the strictest mold of Hindu orthodoxy or even of asceticism were willing to eat with the Europeans whom their leader had accepted. Was the Swami seen dining in Madras with an Englishman and his wife? Was it said that while in the West he had touched beef or wine? Not a quiver was seen on the faces of his brethren. It was not for them to question, not for them to explain, not even for them to ask for final justification and excuse. Whatever he did, wherever he might lead, it was their place to be found unflinching at his side. And surely none can pass this spectacle in review without its being borne in upon him, that meaningless as would have been the order of Ramakrishna without Vivekananda, even so futile would have been the life and labors of Vivekananda without behind him his brothers of the order of Ramakrishna. It was said to me lately by one of the older generation that Ramakrishna had lived for the making of Vivekananda. Is it indeed so? Or is it not rather impossible to distinguish with such fixity between one part and another, in a single mighty utterance of the divine mother heart? Often it appears to me, in studying all these lives, that there has been with us a soul named Ramakrishna Vivekananda, and that in the penumbra of his being appear many forms, some of which are with us still, and none of whom it could be said with entire truth that here ends, in relation to him, the sphere of those others, or that there begins his own. The summer of 1898 stands out in my memory as a series of pictures, painted like old altarpieces against a golden background of religious ardor and simplicity, and all alike glorified by the presence of one who, to us in his immediate circle, formed their central point. We were a party of 4 Western women, one of whom was Mrs. Old Bull of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and another a member of the higher official world of Anglo-Indian Calcutta. Side by side with us traveled the Swami, surrounded by his brethren, or Gurubai, and disciples. Once arrived at Almora, he and his party became the guests of Mr. and Mrs. Sevier, who were then residing there, and we occupied a bungalow some distance away. Thus pleasantly grouped, it was possible to combine a high degree of freedom and intercourse. But when, after a month or so, we left Almora for Kashmir, the Swami went with us as the guest of Mrs. Old Bull. and left behind him all his attendants. What scenes were those through which we journeyed from the beginning of May until the end of October? And with what passionate enthusiasm were we introduced one by one to each point of interest as we reached it? The ignorance of educated Western people about India, excepting of course those who have in some measure specialized on the subject, might almost be described as illiteracy. And our object lessons began, I have no doubt, with Patna, the ancient Pataliputra itself. The riverfront of Benares, as one approaches it by railway from the east, is amongst the sights of the world, and could not fail of our leader's eager praise. The industries and luxuries of Lucknow must needs be dwelt upon and enumerated. But it was not only the great cities of admitted beauty and historic importance that the Swami in his eagerness would strive to impress on our memory. Perhaps nowhere did his love seem more ardent or his absorption more intense than as we passed across the long stretches of the plains covered with fields and farms and villages. Here his thought was free to brood over the land as a whole, and he would spend hours explaining the communal system of agriculture or describing the daily life of the farm housewife with such details as that of the pot au feu of mixed grains left boiling all night for the morning porridge. It was the memory, doubtless, of his own days as a wanderer that so brightened his eyes and thrilled in his voice as he told us these things. For I have heard it said by sadhus that there is no hospitality in India like that of the humble peasant home. True, the mistress has no better bedding to offer than straw, no better shelter than an outhouse built of mud, but it is she who steals in at the last moment, before she goes to rest herself amongst her sleeping household, to place a toothbrush, twig, and a bowl of milk where the guest will find them, on waking in the morning, that he may go forth from beneath her roof, comforted and refreshed. It would seem sometimes as if the Swami lived and moved and had his very being in the sense of his country's past. His historic consciousness was extraordinarily developed. Thus, as we journeyed across the Terai in the hot hours of an afternoon near the beginning of the rains, we were made to feel that this was the very earth on which had passed the youth and renunciation of Buddha. The wild peacock spoke to us of Rajputana and her ballad lore. An occasional elephant was the text for tales of ancient battles, and the story of an India that was never defeated. So long as she could oppose to the tide of conquest the military walls of these living artillery. As we had crossed the boundary from Bengal into the northwest provinces, the Swami had stopped to tell us of the wisdom and methods of the great and merciful English ruler, who was at that time at the head of their administration. Unlike others, he said, in words that impressed my memory at the time, he understands the need of personal government in Oriental countries, where a strong public opinion is not yet developed, so no hospital, no college, no office knows the day when he will pay it a visit of inspection. And even the poorest believes that if only he can reach him personally, he will receive justice at his hands. This idea of the importance of personality in Eastern governments often came uppermost in his talk. He constantly spoke of a democracy as theoretically the worst form for an imperial government to take. And one of his favorite speculations was that it had been a perception of this truth that had urged Julius Caesar on to aspire to the imperial authority. We realized sometimes as we listened to him how hard it had been for the Indian poor to understand the transition from the personal rule of sovereigns, always accessible to appeal, always open to the impulse of mercy, and able to exercise a supreme discretion, to the cold bureaucratic methods of a series of departments. for we heard from him the personal histories of innumerable simple folk who, in the early years of British rule, had spent their all in the vain hope of reaching the Queen and gaining her ear at Windsor. Heartbroken pilgrims, for the most part, who died of wanton disillusionment, far from the homes and villages that they would never see again. It was as we passed into the Punjab, however, that we caught our deepest glimpse of the Master's love of his own land. Anyone who had seen him here would have supposed him to have been born in the province, so intensely had he identified himself with it. It would seem that he had been deeply bound to the people there by many ties of love and reverence, had received much and given much, for there were some amongst them who urged that they found in him a rare mixture of Guru Nanak and Guru Govind, their first teacher and their last. Even the most suspicious amongst them trusted him, and if they refused to credit his judgment or endorse his outflowing sympathy in regard to those Europeans whom he had made his own, he, it may have been, loved the wayward hearts all the more for their inflexible condemnation and incorruptible sternness. His American disciples were already familiar with his picture, that called to his own face a dreamy light, of the Punjab maiden and at her spinning wheel, listening to its Shivoham, Shivoham, I am he, I am he. Yet at the same time, I must not forget to tell that it was here, on entering the Punjab, even as near the end of his life, he is said to have done again at Benares, that he called to him a Mussulman vendor of sweetmeats and bought and ate from his hand Mohammedan food. As we went through some village, he would point out to us those strings of marigolds above the door that distinguished the Hindu homes. Again, he would show us the pure golden tint of skin, so different from the pink and white of the European ideal, that constitutes the fairness admired by the Indian races. Or as one drove beside him in a tonga, he would forget all, in that tale of which he never wearied, of Shiva, the great god, silent, remote upon the mountains, asking nothing of men but solitude, and lost in one eternal meditation.